Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here for the first event of the public program of the AA Summer School 2021. We're very excited to have here with us Studio Ossidiana. It's beside being a very good and hardworking studio and famous studio based in Rotterdam. They're also very dear friends. I'm just going to start before introducing them properly. I'm going to just start by saying a few technicalities on the Zoom kind of context, online context. So Studio Ossidiana is going to do a presentation, and then after that presentation, you should feel free to ask any question. For obvious privacy reasons, you cannot unmute yourself, but you should be available to raise your hands, but also to use the chat below to write any sort of question that you would like to ask to us. I think, yes, and the other maybe a note to be made is that the session is going to be recorded. So just as a side note, okay. So I'm going to introduce Giovanni very briefly, and then I'll leave the floor to him. So, Giovanni, we have here Giovanni Bellotti from Studio Ossidiana. Studio Ossidiana is an award-winning practice in architecture, design, and research based in Rotterdam, led by Alessandra Covini and Giovanni Bellotti. The studio has been founded in 2015, and the practice is always in search of new material expression to translate visions into engaging spaces and objects. Working across multiple scales, Studio Ossidiana blurs the boundaries between architecture, designs, art, landscape, and urban strategies. We will see how their work is often the result of a collaboration with international team of architects, designers, researchers, and is actively involved locally and globally with projects across the Netherlands, Italy, Sweden, Turkey, and the US. Amongst the most recent famous intervention, there is a famous installation called Variation on a Birdcage, which is now showcased at the Venice 2021 Venice Architecture Biennale. So thank you, Giovanni, for being with us.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I think I'm going to share screen. I also have a little introduction about the presentation itself, but thanks a lot, Fra. Very kind, especially on the famous installation for Venice. Let me see. Yes. Okay. Yes. Do you see the correct screen?
We see
full
a
screen now.
One. Now, yes.
Okay, yes. Super. Again, Francesca, I might ask for a sign of life every now and then, because at some point I just don't see anyone and I start to question the whole nature of the thing, if I'm speaking to myself or not. So thanks a lot for inviting us. Actually, Ale could not join. But with Alessandra, who is my partner, we run Studio Ossidiana. As I said, we work in architecture, design, and research. We're based in Rotterdam, and we work at different scales. What I'll show today is kind of one project which is very important to us, almost as a sort of manifesto, and a series of installations which have almost entirely been completed in the last 3 months. Of course, due to pandemic and a series of postponements and kind of planetary misalignments. Before getting there, I wanted to give a bit of an overview of the studio, sort of themes that we hold dear, and something about the method which we've been developing and with which we like to work on design projects. And I mean, in a few words, and very broadly, I think the scope of what we do, or at least what's a bit behind our thinking most of the time, is to sort of try to invent worlds, try to invent places which exist as a sort of effort of the imagination. And the way we look at our projects more and more is actually that what we do is to build a series of fragments, a series of small visions of possible futures, which can, of course, be used and inhabited and have their own agency in that sense, but that all sort of belong to a collective, to a one project. The studio, in fact, was founded as a project, more than as a practice dedicated to sort of finding business. Then, of course, things change and evolve, and we'll get there. And we're interested in designing spaces and working on spaces that require action, that ask for transformation, which are invitations to play, but also to abstract and sometimes to cultivate. Spaces that can tell stories and sort of set the scene for narratives, and that speak about the relation between people, but also between people and other animals. And as Francesca was saying, we try to do this across different scales, through architectural projects, objects, and especially through materials, or at least we have a particular interest in thinking that materials can embody narratives, can embody stories. And often material research is almost a point of departure for most of our work. So the images I'm showing are actually a collection of materials that have been developed for specific projects. Mainly we work with casting, but there's a few other techniques as well. These were developed, for instance, for a playground, which was our first built work, which I'm not going to show today, unless Francesca could really pressure me later, some years ago. These are a series of horticultural composites, at least that's how we've been referring to them, which have as binders lime, sometimes clay, but also cement and gypsum, and then work with earth, hemp. They use spices as pigments for the colors of their materials that also have a smell, a specific smell. And there are materials that we imagine to not to be recycled as much as becoming soil. So we call them sort of cast soils. So they just become soil again through time and use. And these are connected to a project, which I might hint at today. We call these a surf and turf materials, which are made combining actually soils, in a way, industrial soils, elements like expanded clay and charcoal and fertilizers, as well, together with materials from the sea. So into the surfaces that become sort of new terrazzo surfaces. What I'm going to show today actually are 5 projects. Besides the first, they're all very recent, and they've, as I said, happened all in the last 3 months. So Amsterdam Allegris is a project with which Ale and I won the Dutch Pays d'Homme for architecture, which is a competition. It's a rather important competition in the Netherlands. They hold it for architects under the age of 35. So I think we could try once again, but we were already a bit close to the deadline when we did it a few years ago. And I wanted to, I often start with this because it not just contains the themes that we still hold dear and have been developing, but also it was really the beginning of a working method. And the brief for the project was actually to develop a proposal for a public space in an area of Amsterdam, which is called 6th Avenue, which is in Amsterdam North. For those of you who know the city, it's just on the opposite side of the River Eye, over actually the Canal Eye, on the opposite side of the central station, depending on where one comes, to the left or to the right. With the historical city, let's say the Amsterdam we all know, being on the opposite side. And in fact, Amsterdam has always been facing south. It's been the city on the Amstel, and a bit of a starting point for this project was actually the thought that the River Eye, which is, I think you can see your mouse, which is this canal, is the new front of the city. Amsterdam will become the city that grows on the Eye and no longer on the Amstel. And so we've been looking a bit at this area, which was part of the competition brief, in particular at Amsterdam North. And we developed it also as a form of critique, in a way, to the future of public spaces that were being imagined and designed, and in large part sort of built at this point for the city, which is a sort of vocabulary of very rather bold or supposedly bold architectural icons, very kind of polished boulevards and waterfronts, harbors where kind of historical ships are ad hoc brought to in order to sort of attract the eye. So we thought of these as places being extremely timid in a way, and thought that we could actually, through this work, propose a new spatial type. The project became a project for a fenced harbor, which is perhaps a new architectural type, inhabited by 21 floating islands, which we wanted to be a call for new and surreal and experimental public domains, which would be rich in sensorial experiences, in discoveries. The islands we wanted to be places that would make us wonder, at times perhaps even frighten us. And so we began to refer to them as sort of as allegories, as each was referring to a narrative, to a form, to a type, or to a certain idea of nature that we would find in the city. And by the city, we also mean, of course, we expanded the territory of the city. We meant the port, the lake, the polders, the fields, the logistical hubs around it, and so on. So these, in our imagination, our project, these islands would only be accessible by boat. And the thought was that actually boat is not just a space of sort of Amsterdam's happy life with aperitivo and going on a little trip with friends, but it's an kind of radically democratic surface in the way that it's unknown for everyone. There are no beaten paths, and every sort of human is in a way a stranger on water. And in this way, we think of it as a surface that enhances the encounters. It makes them a bit more profound, a bit more vivid. We become a bit closer to each other. Maybe in an experience similar to going on a mountain trail and speaking to someone along the route. We do it also to make our presence known, besides sort of being more happy to see someone along the way. We leave a trace of ourselves, so to say. And so within this context, we began to think of these islands, each almost as a project in itself, each as a small world that would offer a different possibility of use and of misuse. We began to make models of these, to think and design and build models at a rather rapid pace also. The whole project was done maybe in a month and a half. And as each was becoming a project in a way in itself, let's say the work of composition, quite far from a traditional idea of a master plan, became a process of kind of knitting all these stories of architectures, of ideas of nature, that as we were working, were beginning to influence each other, to communicate with each other, to suggest new encounters and new possibilities. I'll go through a few of them quickly. This one was a shore island, which was a tribute to the Dutch coast, which contained for us a thought on the relation between the city and the territory, but also perhaps between the relation between leisure and fear. It's both maybe about coastal erosion and sea level rise, but it's also about sandpit from which roof and chimneys emerged, a place that can be dug, excavated, can be hidden or buried, that can be farmed, where soil can actually be made. This was a house for collective barbecues, which was made around 14 independent fireplace rooms that built the perimeter of this kind of solos, of this conical collective room, which could become a room where you rest in the warmth during winter, or maybe dry up after a summer storm, after swimming in the waters of the eye. We had a black mountain, which was imagined as a floating embassy to the cold peaks of the port downstream. And what we call the Palace of Water, which was dedicated to swimming on the River Eye, which was a sort of floating memory of a floating pavilion that used to be on the Eye around 60 years ago, which was the Obelt bathhouse, which was an open air pool, which here becomes a place to swim along fishes and plants. A floating Turkish bath, which was heated by the collective effort of independent fireplaces. And a series of gardens, one for agricultural, spontaneous and ornamental plants, and above all for their botanical, but more than that, for their cultural intersections, inspired by the Lustovs, these pleasure gardens, as much as by the many sort of third landscapes of the north of the city. This was a thought for a floating square, a very brittle floating square, which would slowly decompose and sink in the water. And as the line that binded, it would sort of balance the acidity given by the nitrogen for cultivation. So balancing the acidity, the pH of the water. And a floating aviary. There'll be quite a lot about birds. So I'm warning you, this is just the beginning, where we began to reflect and rethink or think about the cultural categories we use to approach other animals, the ideas of the native, of the invasive, of the feral, of the domestic, of the tame, and so on. So an aviary, which for us, perhaps like all aviaries, is always at the intersection between politics and zoology. And through those, we began, as I said, to kind of compose and imagine 6-7 as a place made of smells, where there would be smell of earth and fermenting cereals that would mix with the fumes of the barbecues, where wading birds could fish along humans, and where we could share the shore, where there would be mountains of dark soil that work on a skyline along with the masts of the sailing boats, or perches for migratory birds in the distance. A place where you could cross paths, where you'd be at least, very least, sort of meeting people, encountering people, but also where you could perhaps meet other species and begin to cultivate a more nuanced, a more complex relation with or definition of nature. So a place for the possibility of encounters between people and other animals and plants and so on, where one would see in a very intense way the embassies of the territory that we inhabit, the fluxes of the water, the coming and going of the migratory birds, the heaps of materials on the shores and so on, and some of the forgotten elements of the city's architecture. Besides being imagined architects, having the islands were thought to move around the city to create a sort of estranging or familiar or unexpected situations with other figures, other characters of the landscape. In this case, the Silodam, which is actually very close to the MDRDV's housing project, which is quite well known. And with this, to sort of get to new ideas of sublime that could emerge in this sort of landscapes across the waters of the city. So we wanted to, in a way, kind of declare our affection for the messiness of the shore over the sanitized slickness of waterfronts, and the dedication to the unpredictability of the encounter over the vanity of the architectural statement or the kind of supposed boldness of the icon. And as every project, we think it was a bit about us, not about Al and me or our team, but about us as people. So it's also was for us a moment to think that we don't really want to be thought of as consumers, but we want to be thought of as sailors, as gardeners, as farmers, as collectors, or as cartographers of the city. And reflecting on the work, also the reason I show it is because it, besides the themes, it also allowed us to work on a method and a form of representation and a form of understanding of a project and of the agency of the model up to the realization of an installation, which is still with us. So it's a base for many projects, but certainly for the projects I'm going to show now. And this project is called the Fire Dune, and this was very recently completed, but it was actually the first commission we received after presenting Amsterdam Allegories to the public. It was exhibited at the New Institute, which is a design and architecture museum in Rotterdam in 2018. And I think this was the first conversation we had with a real client in our studio. And it really took quite some time for this to be developed. And initially it was commissioned for the city of Almere. And some of you may know a bit the geography of the Netherlands, but just to give you an idea, everyone knows the kind of the Netherlands is flat and quite large parts of it sort of below seawater level. The region of Almere, which is called Flevoland, is in a way the flattest. It's actually, for the most part, below sea level. And it's the result of a huge reclamation project that went on for over 50 years. And here we were commissioned to design a public space on a beach a couple of years ago. In this territory, which we find, well, incredibly fascinating in a way, it has a very powerful, full kind of 20th century and even rather violent history, let's say, in today's eyes. Of course, it wasn't built from nothing. It was sea. There was an ecology of the sea, which became an ecology of land. This used to be the Flevoland, used to be the Zuiderzee, which was the inner sea of the Netherlands. And so perhaps in this kind of vast flatness, we began to look for mountains. And what we began to do is a collection, which is still going on, of dunes and heaps, from the ones transported by barges to the heaps around construction sites. And we began to almost see them as a kind of very typical Flevoland form of landscape, which speaks everything about the sand, tells everything about the sand being dredged, being brought on land, and then becoming soil again, become the beginning of agriculture and so on. So we began to look at this as a genre of landscape. And what started to happen was that the world, of course, changed around us. With COVID, Almere had no budget, but the photographic collection was just growing and growing. And it seems like we can't see anything but heaps for about a year until we get invited by an association from Utrecht to think about an installation for the space, which is a very different area. And the context is rather surreal. And it's to start with the kind of idea for this place, which is in fact to build a new town. And this is a project of the 21st century, unlike Almere. So there's an idea of building a new town, which is sort of tangential to Utrecht, of which an art association is actually a big area given to manage for some years. which, as we visited the first time a couple of years ago, is in an interest in sort of agro-residential limbo. There are reed roofs and industrial chimneys. There's a scent of coffee being toasted in a big industrial plant close by, but there's also smell of asphalt. There's dust and puddles that are starting to turn into ponds. So it's this kind of big landscape of infrastructure, of a lot of projects that are coming up, which is absolutely temporary and has its own evolution of spontaneous plants, spontaneous uses, and so on. There's flocks of birds everywhere making a buffet out of the worms that kind of come up from the soil that is being dug up. And here we find other landscape of dunes, of heaps of sand, of soil and bricks, and are in fact quite fascinated. Most of the time living in the Netherlands, you have a feeling that the last thing left to do is to pass a vacuum cleaner. And here we find a sort of contemporary wilderness, which is temporary, of course, but it's both a botanical and kind of a social wilderness of opportunities. And then we begin to think that perhaps between those dunes and the others in Almere, there wasn't such a big difference, and all the sand comes dredged from the North Sea. And in a way, also the project of the territory of the Netherlands is the same. A country which is fully dedicated towards endlessly rebuilding itself, where there is perhaps no difference between nature and infrastructure, or at least it's not an interesting difference to be found. It's maybe not the right terms to look at it. So we started to think we found a place for our fireplace. And from dunes, we start to collect fires. So we start to look at stoves, at chimneys, at campfires. We look at the collective rituals of open fires and at the domestic fireplaces, sometimes small rooms in themselves, perhaps big enough to sort of sit within. We remain fascinated by the stoves, which is kind of, well, we call them Russian stoves, but I understand they could be Polish stoves, or a number of nationalities could kind of claim these stoves, but we love these kind of vast multifunctional objects, which can become a bed, can become an oven, can be used as a kitchen, and are somewhere there between architecture and furniture and an architectural model. It's a sort of big thermal mass in the building. So our project becomes a series of variations on a fireplace, one imagined as a portal, one as a kitchen, one as a sort of scenographic wall, and one as a crater on the top to transform the heap into a volcano with different orientations to protect from the wind. So as the dune is covered in sand, the dune itself, the sand itself, is heated by the fireplace. So it becomes a sort of geological Russian stove, actually made of sand, that heats the rooms and the sand itself as it is lit, and then offers places to cook by the dunes, where it becomes a scenography by the fire. We actually had a series of iterations. This is, well, I think it would happen anyway, but it definitely happens when there's 2 years between the concept and the kind of sequence step of a project. So it begins to be, variations begin to emerge. We debate whether they should be almost dispersed around the city or if they should be condensed and so on. And they become, like models do, small worlds, which for us are there to sort of be explored. And they become operative in many ways. We try to look at them in a way in which a photographer or someone who doesn't know the project would try to look at it, that is by exploring it rather than by explaining it, and through which to test also different configurations, of course. In this case, the materials are almost one-to-one. There's steel, there's sand, and there's fire. And the chimneys are in fact instruments, which can be tools, which can be moved, used to modify the soil, used to frame it, to be kind of compose as kind of a malleable mountain to maintain with time. So in plan and section, it's really a few lines. And in fact, the layout was almost decided on site. I'll show some photos of how this kind of came to be. And they build this kind of small, but we think quite precious topography in a country where a few centimeters are difference between being in water or being dry. We usually and often take photos of a model by night. So these are taken on our terrace as we lit up the dune on the balcony of our office and started to explore the scenes up to this one of the main fire room until a month and a half ago, we actually opened the exhibition, and this was the first fire being lit in the main fire room. We call it I called it an exhibition, but in fact it's a public space, and it's open. If any of you happens to be in the Netherlands, it's completely accessible. We cooked there for the first time in March, in a rather cold night. We had pizzas actually from a local chef. Pizza was terrible, but they didn't blame the oven. We are not blaming the chefs. Everything, international relations are good. And yeah, what we really wanted to do was actually to have a project that would bring together this kind of domestic, intimate scale of a fire, of the individual cooking, with this kind of collective ritual of a bonfire, of a fallow. Of course, when we went back to Utrecht after visiting it the first time, the site had completely changed. Now our construction site was surrounded by buildings. That there were neighbors that were looking down on the dune as if it was some kind of strange guest that like was there in their garden. Basically, it was really almost there in their backyard, or some kind of memory of all the heaps that used to be there, because there were not as many heaps when we went the last time. These photos are actually by an Italian photographer who also lives in Rotterdam, called Riccardo de Vecchi. And I mention him also because I'm basically showing a photographic project for the realization of this. And we collaborate with him and we ask him to photograph, especially the process of installation. And they show how this project, but perhaps all projects, are not something fixed, but something that moves and changes shape. And how this project especially perhaps is a model, which I even hesitate to refer to as one-to-one. It has the same process and materials of our models. It requires much more energy and calories to be moved around, but the principles are the same. Even the physics are the same. The steepness of the dune is the same, and so on. And different sort of landscapes emerge once you're able to kind of immerse yourself in it. Perhaps 2 minarets in the distance. Finally, we managed to draw our crater, which transformed the dune in a volcano. And sort of this place where strange things started to happen almost from the same day. The first night, I think there was a van parked in front of it with people kind of hiding some coal under some how's it called, this kind of still red coal under some sand in order to have breakfast the next day. And of course, a lot of games and a lot of things we had never thought about. Capaiola, how do you say capaiola? These spinning things from kids throwing themselves from the volcano in ways that the safety insurance would never have approved of. And so it's a place which we think is extremely particular. There's smell of food cooking, there's sand, there's logs burning. It's a bit of really a silhouette at night. And for the most part, it's really matter before it becomes material. For the most part, it's really sand. And it's a place that sort of makes no sense without actions. I'm gonna go through the variations in a birdcage, which Francesca also mentioned. If you have a chance, part of this work is actually exhibited in Venice. If not, I'm gonna show most of it anyway. So that should do at least for this project. I hope you will be able to follow me, because it's a slightly more complex project to explain, because it's known many faces. In fact, it's a project that focuses on some of the objects we, and by we I mean people, let's say, some people used to mediate their encounter with other species. And the reason it's a bit stratified, it's because it's more of a theme than an individual piece. It began as my postgraduate thesis in urbanism when I was in the States 3 years ago. It continued almost immediately after my graduation as a commission for a Turkish artist for whom we designed some geese shelters. And then it went on with an exhibition and the research for the New Institute Museum in Rotterdam. Then we had the residency at the Van Eyck Academy in Maastricht around this. And eventually the biennial became a kind of other stream of research for it. It's a theme that is also kind of very close to Ali and I personally. We live with a parrot. He's an Amazon parrot, and he's called Coco. And we also kind of designed some objects for him, perhaps inevitably over time. So it's a project that's been with us for a while. So I hope you'll be able to kind of follow me in the different and sometimes even contradictory steps it took. But it's known on these scales as a sort of urban, almost territorial scale, the scale of furniture making, architectural projects, material research. But the beginning and the focus is always the cage, in a way. Always the cage as an object, and perhaps a cage as an archetype. So the cage and the relatives of the cage, the perches, the feeders, the aviaries. So these tools kind of designed to allow some kind of human and non-human coexistence. Admittedly, most of the time, a rather simplified, crude, and obviously violent one. But the scope, let's say the ambition of the project or the idea has always been to actually see the cage not so much as a place where we contain or we frame a certain idea of nature, so not just as an enclosure, but really as a political object, really as a form of communication, potentially as a form of language. The cage is always physical and tangible, but it's always a model as well. It's always speaking about something else. It's always a model of our ideas of nature, perhaps, or of politics. And I'm saying other animals, but in fact, we're particularly interested in birds. Oops, sorry, I went back a slide because I have. Oops, now you see yourselves. I'm making a mess. Maybe it's not too bad. And we're particularly actually interested in birds. Birds carry metaphors in almost every culture, perhaps more than any other species. They connect the earth and the sky. They're between heaven and earth. But birds are also the greatest force behind the kind of globalized nature that we have today. They disperse seeds, they adapt, they migrate, they exist in every corner of the planet. So they're always around us, we're always very close. And I think they're even within us. I think probably the imitation of birds precedes and leads to every sort of music, and from that to every sort of language that we know. And so at the beginning, we're really focusing on birds which are not kept for utilitarian purposes. So we didn't want to look at farming or other practices, but we wanted to look at the practice of keeping birds for pleasure, for the singing, for companionship. Of course, this is a line that becomes blurred almost immediately. So this is one of the steps, let's say, the project took over time. But the focus on the cage was there because with all these kind of burdens, that's one tool for which we bring them in the domestic realm, and not just as metaphors or as music, but as physical beings. We bring like a small ecology with all its conflicts, with all its flows of energy inside the home. So what we began to do was actually to work on some cages ourselves by working on a series of models, some which would work as an interpretation of existing architectural types. Others would be physical sketches of our own proposals. Some would be, we did some working on larger prototypes. The idea would always be to, in a way, challenge the cage to be an intermediary between people and birds. So I'm going to ask a question. Is it super annoying that I now I don't know how to get rid of your own video from the screen? I guess you're all seeing yourselves.
No, we can see your slides.
Yeah.
So fine.
Yeah. Okay, that's all right. Thanks. So at least I'm sure that 4 people are definitely there and attentive because you see yourselves. So these are some of the models that we began to work on, and this is a kind of expanded collection, which is currently shown in Venice. And one of the perhaps of the reasons why these cages are so interesting and I think so powerful also as a type, as a spatial type to investigate is that they don't just contain but also represent life. They simplify it, they abstract it. In a way in which perhaps also the garden does, or the carpet does to a garden. So the carpet abstracts the garden, which in turn can abstract the whole idea of nature. This was a model we made for a small foldable cage, which would sort of flatten itself into a pure display of a bird paraphernalia, so sort of 2-dimensional piece displaying this simplification of nature. Developed over time, it became this kind of interconnected walls, which as pushed and pulled and pivoted, it could transform and negotiate the space of a bird and that of a person. We began to think of it as a domestic screen, which would allow some kind of coexistence and some kind of spatial debate. As through it and within it, territories would be created and occupied as walls are removed and eaten apart and so on. This is a diagram that synthesizes the viewing space of some insectivore birds, and I bring it in because it was sometimes important to think about an action, about a single action. So with this sketch object, we wanted to visualize, let's say, I think more than accommodate the veering space of a sparrow, and to lead to the place where we begin to think of air as a kind of territory and as a form of infrastructure in itself. Other models we made, trying to think about what a territory is. Is it for a bird, it may be a bush or a tree or some shrubs, but the change of perspective, the territory of a tree. So the space it needs to live, to reproduce, and to grow includes rocks, lichens, fungi, several birds' nests, a lot of bacteria, and so on. So even within the cage, which simplifies nature to such an extreme, there are still so many possible interferences or possibilities of changing the gaze. I mentioned we worked on a commission, and these are the 3 geese grottos which we developed for a Turkish artist for his farm in eastern Turkey, in Erzincan, which are designed actually for the geese to lay eggs. They're not a space for the geese to live in, and for the geese to lay eggs twice a year. So go inside, lay the eggs, and the business of the farm is actually to sell fertilized egg. So the farmer actually can oversee the flock from the terrace above. So they're half submerged in the land. They're sort of like very big, colorful bricks in this rather flat plain of Erzincan. If any of you know that sort of landscape, it's a rather extreme climate, actually very, very warm in the summer, very cold in the winter. And so in this, we did a sort of sign on the ground, which really blocks the wind and gives a terrace to the farmer to oversee the birds. I mentioned that some projects we looked at were actually almost direct translations of architectural types that we found particularly powerful. And these are veocoli. Some of you may know them, or they may be kind of analog structures in other parts of the world. The one I know are veocoli, which are Italian, and they're essentially hunting devices that have been used since the 14th century to capture migratory birds alive, which, as you can imagine, is not an easy feat to accomplish. And the way they work, I find to be, well, extremely violent and also extremely fascinating in a way, very contemporary. There would be a singing bird, which would be used as a lure, sort of to attract other birds to this gardened enclosure. Nets would be concealed around this kind of perimeter of shrubs and trees with berries and fruit trees and so on. And then once attracted to this enclosed garden, birds would be frightened with a decoy, which would be called a spauracchio, so something that brings fear, which would resemble a bird of prey. So they would fly close to the ground to escape in order to monitor the shadows of the birds above and ultimately remain caught in the nets. So it's hunting in this method has been prohibited in Italy. There's still some active which are being preserved. There's, as I said, a sort of obvious violence in these objects. There's kind of violence perhaps in every interaction, but this one is very tangible. It's very literal. But there's also something, I think, kind of intriguing in an object which is part architecture, part animal, part human, and part plant. And all of these elements need to work together for this object to work. We've had what we've been referring to as a pigeon phase, which is a kind of obsession over architecture for pigeons. They're an exceptional family of birds. They range from the ubiquitous rock dove to prized sort of racing birds, with an array of relations to people that is as vast as a known history of people. So it goes from agriculture and communication to leisure and farming, and goes deep in the field of metaphors. Doves have been symbolically freed by popes and revolutionaries for centuries, and brides, and anyone really. This one was inspired by Egyptian dovecotes, which celebrates the Columba livia domestica, which is the earliest bird said to have been domesticated probably in Egypt between 10 and 20,000 years ago. And this is a bird actually that is so tied to human survival I think at the scale of the planet. Before people, Faizab and Karl Bosch figured out a way to fix nitrogen artificially in the 1910s, we would be collecting guano from pigeons, a lot of it also from birds, especially in Latin America. And we would be keeping the birds not just for their meat, but especially for their guano, which was a source of fertilizers. And fertilizers meant farming. They also meant explosives. So an animal which was in a way completely designed by people, which I think is tied to wars, to politics, to economy, which is somehow today is looked as an unnecessary, kept for racing or display, but mainly regarded as a form of nuisance. We sketched Dovecote Tower inspired by Oscar Niemeyer's work in Brasilia, of course, where the bird, the pigeon, again took another meaning, perhaps, in the capital of a free country. Another modular tower collecting a stack of architectural styles transformed into pigeon lofts, and then a timber version, which was covered in shingles, with like this idea of a bird tower dressed like a bird. And we actually, we worked on this with a Pigeon Fancier Association from the Netherlands, and I'll get back to it later because a version of this is also exhibited in Venice right now. Along the Pigeon Towers, we also ran into very fascinating stories about bat towers. In particular, this specific bat tower, which comes from an American patent, caught a bit our imagination, especially because they capture a very early idea of what is now called, what we referred to today as ecosystem services. So the sort of monetization, or at least translation into a monetary value of an environmental service, so to say, given by animals or plants, whether it's purifying water or capturing CO2 and so on. And so these were built to basically keep bats in order to fight malaria, which was of course a problem in many parts of the world. It's a long story, and I already feel like I'm a bit over time, being less than halfway through. But they were a project patented by an American engineer, eventually acquired by an Italian army general. And this was happening in the 30s. So it was happening right before the two countries were at war. And it was also a fantastic exercise in propaganda. The Italian version on the left, of course, has a sign also which says the bats are not sent from the devil. They're actually your friends and here to protect us. So it became a chapel. There's even a cross on top. And also this project was portrayed as a kind of great success. In fact, I think bats did live there to get rid of malaria. There were decades of drainage and of other kind of projects. But nonetheless, it was an interesting, I think, experiment, especially kind of way into this kind of politics that tie us to other animals. So our model bat tower became an interpretation of one of the many bat houses that were built in Sardinia in the 30s. This you perhaps all know. I imagine what we're particularly interested in the Snowdon Aviary is in fact the cliff, besides a fantastic tensile structure. And the idea that somehow the cliff was meant to stay, and that it was meant to host the birds once the territory had been established, once a colony of birds would already inhabit this place. While the net was also designed in a way to allow smaller birds to fly in and out and protecting the collection of the zoo from larger urban birds. So the cliff was actually our focus, and that's what we built the model of. Bird perches, there'll be quite a few of these. They also became an obsession. From the kind of ones we recognize almost at a territorial scale, like birds of prey or migratory birds, nest or rest, to the domestic perches for parrots or the paraphernalia for falconry. We see them almost as a family of buildings made of lines. And these touch, as I mentioned, upon different scales. These are some we started to design as tall perches, which would be visible from afar, which would become actually only legible as a project from a bird's eye perspective, as their cast shadows becomes a language from the air. And we also made models for larger aviaries. This one was designed to open once the bird territory would be established within. The frame would no longer be needed, taking on, of course, the idea of Cedric Price, and perhaps leaving the metal mesh in a way, allowing birds to pass, the poles to flex in the wind, and only forbidding the entrance to kind of larger, clumsier, ground-based mammals. We started to work with these also across diagrams and at different scales. The possibilities of intersection and contamination, we think, are plenty, and of also complicating the discourse around them. So we started to think of cages within cages, where the habitats of birds and people would collide or be superimposed. Thinking perhaps of establishing different gradients of maintenance and exploring the paradox of a definition of wild, which requires us to be left outside. So the one with the least human presence, the one which is the most protected, would be the wildest. Into a sort of zoo defined through acts of invasion and liberation towards kind of ever more overlaid territories. So this was sort of a vocabulary of encounters that we started to develop. And what we wanted to bring up is the fact that, of course, cage can be violent and crude in the way it simplifies the world, but it's also a rather special moment because in a very legible way, it's a place where quantitative and sentimental scales kind of come together and can be addressed and looked at and debated together. And that's something we think is quite important, actually, to be able to maintain a sentimental scale also when thinking about territories. But for me is to think that bird is an individual bird, but it's also a flock, and it may be considered an invasive species, but it's still a single as well. I mentioned it ranges across different scales, and actually this project started when I was in the States. We're still in the bird part of the presentation, by the way. When I was in the States, I actually started to work on furniture. This is being developed in parallel as an urban project, and I was getting more and more interested in quack furniture, sort of quintessential North American furniture. So when we were back in the Netherlands, especially at the beginning of the quarantine last year, we were in a complete crisis like most people, but we also had a lot of time, and a lot of time with our parrot was flying in the office. So we started to make furniture for us and for him. So until June last year and some pieces a bit later, we began to make these objects for him and for us. This was a bench, which is a variation on sort of Windsor benches designed to accommodate us and him together. A chair, which has a sort of elongated backrest for Coco to sit on as we work and eat. And we're in love with this furniture style because it allows a series of variations, actually. And it's kind of inherently a bit quirky. We developed more. This one was a throne for a person and a bird, which would be sort of part perch, part chair, part bird. So it would have a bird on the branches above and the sort of featherless companion on the lower part of it. This one is Coco's favorite by far because he has the vantage point. We did some which were actually coat hangers, which are not great for sort of expensive clothes, but are good for the bird who always sort of finds new objects on it as everything sort of becomes a toy. Side table where again the keys become toys and so on. And over time we worked on more, of course, and this was a modular bench, which then became actually the prototype for what is now in Venice, which is a sort of man-made rock. We thought of it actually as being installed in a garden and as a garden in itself. So where the lake is abstracted into a water bowl, the mountain into a block of clay, the forest into a series of perches and so on. It was meant to be shared with a domestic bird or with ducks. In this case, this was installed at the Venice and ducks were around. So this is what happened. But also in a way, it's a bit of a map. So a place you can also abandon and decide how much to kind of keep clean, cultivate or not, and so on. We had it on the ground floor of the Van Eyck Academy. As I said, there was sort of early family of ducks with, well, 2 males courting a female, actually. They would join for aperitivo, and as time went by, we actually developed it for the Venice Architecture Biennale, where we wanted to bring different scales together, perhaps the scales I presented so far, into kind of one macro object, from the models to the dovecote towers to domestic perches that we're using with Coco. So in Venice, what we brought is actually a modular cast landscape, which is rich in these affordances and sort of possibilities of action where you can play, eat, and so on. I think I'm realizing it's a bit late, and I'm going to speed up a bit because I have 2 projects after this one, and birds always take more time than I wanted to. Chess, of course, also a fantastic example of sort of one-to-one and the model in itself. Simple set of rules, infinite possibilities of variations and virtuosism, edible insertions, and so on. We're back to the pigeons. These were the first pigeon lofts that we installed in Maastricht. I mentioned there were ducks, and they were absolutely did not care that they were peeking and eating into pigeon lofts. And what we decided to do later on was actually to propose a pigeon tower for Venice. So we designed one for the Venice Biennial. It's now in the Giardino delle Vergini. For those of you who know it, it's kind of, let's say, the end of the exhibition. Typically the place where you would kind of, finally breathe after this kind of extremely long, curated, kilometer-long exhibition. And we wanted it to be a bit of an echo. Sorry, my slides are stuck. To the city's bell towers, which are actually visible, but also to be the sort of feathered metallic bird, perhaps protecting its flock. offering shelter to pigeons, to magpies, to the ravens, and sort of the urban birds, a sort of Trojan horse for birds in Venice, which again becomes a bit mimetic with the stainless steel shingles, which take the color of the context. So Pigeon Tower dressed like a bird with a beak, complete with beak gutter and bird feet, overseeing the flock of Venetian pigeons. Okay, I'll try to go a bit quicker. Two more projects. It's a project that we just completed for ACTES, which is a National Museum of Architecture and Design in Stockholm, in Sweden. It was commissioned as a public space for their public program, which is called Utomhusverket, which they've been running and will run every year from now. We envisioned this as a sort of garden and as a map where intersecting frames would design the place for encounter between different people, but also in a way different species. The overall space object is kind of conceived actually as an astronomical clock. It points north and follows the axis that mark the dusk and dawn on the 21st of June. So as kind of strangers to this kind of infinite day, that's what we wanted to look at and celebrate. And so the whole installation is actually based on a clock that where everything kind of comes together on one day of the year, and it will be installed until mid-November. The project was actually thought of as this place for, this should be a video, yes, of encounter between people and birds, but also plants and minerals and artificial rocks. So it's a tribute to the ground, and it's made with different types of soil, different kinds of shells, gravel, loam, sand, which compose a sort of big mandala, which mixes as people walk on it and dig it and find sort of hidden treasures within it. We see it as a sort of stage in a way for these urban and horticultural rituals, and of course the possibility of curation for the museum itself, which was also part of the request, where soils get mixed, things get dug, feet get wet, some flowers can be picked and so on, but also places where you can play games, sunbathe, gather, sleep, and so on. I think I need to speed up a little bit more actually. So I'll go over. This is the sundial, which was actually meant to work as one person standing, would become the gnomone. I'm sorry, I don't know the word in English for this, but let's say the vertical pole, which actually marks the time. Francesca is nodding negatively, so no. This was our bird garden, which would again play a bit on this paradox of a nature that we only recognize the value of if we're not allowed to be in it. So it would be a bit of an abstraction of a Swedish forest with mosses, different types of berries, ivy, juneberry trees, which would only be accessible to birds. And of course, well, some children were kind of going inside nonetheless, but you would be allowed perhaps to pick a berry from the openings. And there's some elements which we picked up. We also worked during the production of Venice. So we also managed to develop the platform into a sort of modular system, which we could develop over time. And this is, I think, really something quite important in the process and the method of a studio, of a small studio like ours. So this is a sort of fragment of the Venice Biennale, which was being tested live in public space, as it is now installed outside in Stockholm, with a chess piece and a backgammon set and a series of other games. And this was happening, I think, in Somai the Italian designer had just passed a few months before we started to work on this. So we did a small tribute to his animal puzzles with an entirely bird designed puzzle, following the beautiful pieces he produced and that are now being made by Danese, I think. At the center of Utomhusverket, there's a pond, sort of mirror of water. And most carpets actually have a pond or a fountain as a sort of belly of the world at their center, and so did ours, which becomes a sort of dark mirror reflecting the sky and the surroundings. Immediately was discovered by sort of feathered inhabitants of the area, and from their perspective, this was imagined as a buffet. The shells are actually edible, they bring calcium, the plants could actually be food, there are plenty of bird feeders and so on. So it became quite quickly this sort of spa for birds, where they would sort of lay on the rock, in some cases also aggressively intimidate human guests, which we received a couple of worried phone calls from the curators who were wondering if this was expected or not. well, young humans also use it, of course. They play water games, and as birds observe, especially from the perches, which again make their appearance and actually here do work as these kind of clocks somewhere between towers and masts and antennas. Another privileged position for a family of seagulls that use them as vantage points, which actually does leave us very worried about the family of ducks. So we hope that actually the curators at ArcDes will take their responsibility of literally taking care of the work and perhaps protecting the ducks from the seagulls and sort of having an eye for human and non-human population. I'll want to go through one last project, which is happening now, actually. It's called Buyukada Songlines, and it's a project we've recently come back from the installation of in Istanbul. It's the first time I actually presented, and I was just telling Francesca, I have kind of a bad feeling that the second part of it will look a bit like sort of summer holiday photos, because we haven't had time to kind of properly contextualize it perhaps, but we're extremely excited about it, and I'm really happy to share it. It's a project that was developed for the Istanbul Design Biennial. This was following an invitation from Mariana Pestana, the curator, who invited us to work on along the theme to which we felt a lot of sympathy and interest of sort of design for more than one, sort of rethinking empathy. And the project is essentially a floating garden, which we designed to navigate the waters of Marmara and the Bosphorus, connecting Istanbul's Princess Islands with the Asian and European shores of the city. Before I get there, I want to share a little bit of what was behind the project, or what has kind of been accumulated in over now almost 3 years of work, because it began, biennials were postponed, and so on and so forth. These images are actually from Ottoman era miniatures, and they show a selection of floating pavilions, which in different times have inhabited the waters of Istanbul. So it's a project that for us exists within a certain tradition of architecture, which is in no way exclusive to a culture or a place. We actually began to look at these kind of rituals and spaces of water as something that really binds many water cities, because they have the power of speaking of context in which are immersed in the water that the place or object touches, but also the shores it is seen from, but also of other places, all the waters and cultures and places that the barge or the boat could go to or could have been in. You probably all know the Teatro del Mondo, the project, Aldeos's project, which combines the early Florentine kiosk with Elizabethan references and architecture of lighthouses and Venetian architecture, of course, into this kind of ephemeral stage for which the scenography of which would always be the city, so both a space and a sort of inhabitant of the space. And among other sort of contemporary projects you may have seen, also because I think it's been built sort of after the passing of Robert Smithson. It's been built recently. This is a sketch for a floating garden that Robert Smithson imagined for Manhattan, actually. I think in the 70s, but yes. And again, there's what I think is really powerful about these places, of which the list could go on for a long time, is that they're not just powerful as a spatial archetype in their evoking of the ship or the island, but they're powerful as a form of narration, as a device for narration. They make space belong to a tradition of stories which are being told on water, from Homer to Conrad, from Stevenson to Ezra Le Guin, and again, from Aldeossi to Robert Smithson and so on. I hope maybe some of you are familiar with the geography of Istanbul. I thought I just had to say a few words, otherwise it would be a bit difficult to sort of understand where we went. Istanbul is a city of 20 million inhabitants, typically described as sort of being the bridge or the space between Asia and Europe. It's certainly at the convergence of the waters of the Mediterranean waters of the Aegean Sea through the Dardanelles Strait, flowing into Marmara, and through the Bosphorus waters, which come from the Black Sea. Historically, it's kind of looked at as the convergence of these three cities of part of Galatapea, of the Golden Horn, and of the Asian shores of Scutari. And what you see in the picture on the bottom part is actually Malmö. On the top part, it's a Black Sea, the kind of big body of water. That's a Bosphorus, and the Golden Horn is a sort of smaller body of water, defining the space between Galata and let's say the area where Topkapi Palace is. And the islands are this archipelago of 9 islands, which are 5 miles off the Asian coast, which have a story of being a place of retreat and of exile. They've been inhabited for thousands of years. They have a unique microclimate and unique ecology. By unique, I mean that it's different from the one of continental Istanbul, but it's also not exactly Mediterranean. They were a place of exile for Ottoman royalty for centuries, and even before that, for Byzantine royalty. It's also the place where Leon Trotsky, fleeing the Soviet Union, went to before going to Mexico, and he lived in Buyukada, the largest of the islands, for 4 years between 1929 and 1933. The house where he used to live is still there, sort of overlooking the coast. So it's a place where writers, intellectuals, but also fishermen, and today many tourists and sort of these Turkish jet setters go to. And it's, I think, called multicultural, both in its human composition and in sort of non-human compositions. The waters of Malmö are fascinating. There's brackish waters from the Black Sea, which flow on top, saltier waters of the Mediterranean Sea, which flow beneath. And it's an ecology of sort of human and non-human nomads, which for thousands of years have been flickering between cultivation and abandonment and wilderness. There's many stories of dependence and interferences between the flows of people and those of seeds, of fishes and birds and so on. So in this place, actually, and of course we had friends and colleagues, and it's a place we visited many times that we've begun to build a relationship with over time. I won't be able to show it, but it actually began with a smaller exhibition that we organized there some years ago. In this silence, we began to imagine the project of Buyukada songline, sort of initially echoing a bit the idea of of Chatwin's diaries and recounter of the Aboriginal songlines, which remained as a sort of powerful reminder for us that territories emerge not only as a map, but they can be imagined also as a form of knowledge of stories, of music, of plants and minerals. So this was the route that we initially planned, which is obviously a bit erratic, but our idea would be to build a barge on the Asian shore, navigate around Buyukada, around the archipelago, coming from the Asian side and head towards the European coast of Marmara before returning to the islands with this embassy of the Princess Islands. And this 2 weeks ago was our garden docked on the commercial port of Buyukada, sort of waiting to sail off. So it's really a design project and a journey, which is sort of this curated travel, which we organize across the islands, collecting plants, but also stories and sort of insects and various passengers along the way. And so as a sort of floating embassy, which would move across the nine islands, and the material would be recorded. We've been collaborating with a series of filmmakers, but also with a local radio. So conversations, recordings, physical materials would be its collection, which would be both curated through events and quite literally cultivated. It's just about the space itself. It's had quite a few iterations, but it's sort of inhabited by 3 installations. The first is an iteration of our platform. In this case, actually materialized by a local artisan who did a fantastic job, and also with very different techniques. A marine terrazzo medallion, which is a kind of abstraction of the map of the islands, which is made with shells and rocks which have been gathered in the archipelago. This is sort of central medallion of again relating to a tradition of a central medallion as a water fountain, and the grid of perches and bird feeders, which became perfect spots for the gulls again to rest on. And at the end of the journey, which is actually not complete yet, today the barge was traveling back to Buyukada. This will be installed permanently on the island in a park owned by the municipality. Sorry, and now it's stuck. There we are. So I'll quickly go through the images, but what we really wanted to have was actually for the garden to be this kind of place which exists at the threshold of politics, of design and ecology, where you can have a conversation, an abstract conversation about things while things are extremely grounded, where you can speak and abstract soil and nature, but you are actually touching soil, where we can speak about the ecology of the islands and we're seeing what we are speaking of. We're moving towards them and so on. So where we would always flicker between the abstraction and the material. During the route, in the days also with thanks to the team of curators, the young curators group from Istanbul, of course, Mariana Pestana and Denisova, who's a curator, everyone put in a tremendous effort, because I'm not speaking about the logistics of what this project meant for us and many others, but we had this kind of public and nomadic pavilion, which was populated by people, dancers, academics, fishermen, insects, quite a lot of feral cats over time, which were kind of hitching a ride really between the islands. Again, the photos are from Riccardo de Vecchi, who traveled with us on very short notice to take the photos. To the very last moment, we didn't know if regulations would have allowed us to travel there. This is actually the last stretch of the journey as the barge arrived in Buyukada. It's greeted by a frankly surprised captain, and then sort of takes off actually towards the mainland. I mentioned earlier with Amsterdam Allegories why water to us was important, and I think it's a place where we kind of rediscuss what rules mean. There's something beautiful in the rules of water, where navigation and priorities and rights are given more by size and maneuverability. So they're more a malleable set of rules rather than being kind of inscribed in do's and don'ts. So a place where a lot of things fade. The distinction between locals and tourists, between native and foreigner, the moment plants move from one island to the other, and where everyone sort of becomes a bit of a traveler. And through this kind of garden room, we also became observers of the city as it moved around the coast of Buyukada. This is the island, the uninhabited island of Neanderthals, which is actually inhabited by a rather healthy colony of cormorants. This is approaching the coast of Velibeliada, and in the distance, we see places which are also extremely powerful and have really important stories to tell. This is Sevillada, which is an island which you see in the distance. And this is a place where in 1911, around 30,000 dogs were abandoned. Feral dogs were abandoned by the city of Istanbul too, and were left to die. And there are still stories about the kind of the ghost of these dogs and the howling still sort of haunting the place. This is Yasyada, and this is where, following the 1960s coup, the government was actually trialed, and many of the politicians and academics that were arrested there were sentenced and then executed. And of course, it has a much older tradition than this. It's also where I think the patriarch, the Armenian patriarch, already in the 4th century, was imprisoned. So the barge arrived and traveled with kind of people, ourselves, with some researchers and some of the guests of the boat, and some kind of non-human passengers which moved around with us. I'll go a bit quickly. Eventually, arriving and seeing Fatih with I think is a blue mosque and Hagia Sophia that you can see in the distance, and the mosques of Suleiman and Yamikami as we're about to pass under the Galata Bridge. Before docking in Alić, where the barge stayed until today, before leaving one last time for the island, and sort of finally, eventually delivering, if the journey went well, because we haven't heard back yet, the kind of man-made rocks and objects to Buyukada. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think it's, I mean, it was very, very nice to see it. And I have to say that there is, if I can make a few comments, maybe just to also put out there a series of thoughts that I have. Like I took a lot of notes, especially at the beginning. And there is, I think that there is also, I've been seeing also other times some of your presentation. I think there is a kind of a beautiful narrative now that has been created, especially with the addition of this last project. You mentioned yourself the use of water, but also this idea of starting with an archipelago, right? Like in this almost project manifesto that is Amsterdam Allegories, and then ending with a sort of floating garden island. I think there is something quite nice and quite poetic about it. I have a lot of thoughts and a lot of questions, which I really have to put together, but like I think that most of them really relates to the methodology on what you called and what that you explained through the project of Amsterdam Allegories. There is, of course, one of the reasons why I proposed to invite Studio Ossidiana is I'm really fascinated by the use of model, right? Like that the usage of the model, both as a research tool, but also as an architecture itself. And that becomes really like a space for interpretation, you said, right? Like you use the word of like creating and inventing worlds, right? And I think that the materiality of the model and the almost create something almost oniric also through the usage of the color too. So I have a lot of thoughts about and questions that I have on the use of color, but also on the use of the model itself. So, but also this and the use of the technique. So there is, let's say I would start with these three. First of all, this idea of the usage of the technique, because I'm also myself quite interested as a method, as a methodology, especially also academically speaking, whether the use of the casting model, right, like is something that is capable to reduce architecture to a very simple gesture, to something super precise, archetypical, right? So that is, of course, it's something that is I'm very interested in whether what's the role and what's like whether you ever thought of using something else than a casting model, for instance, and how that would alter, right, the role of the model and the usage of the model in your process of work. And then next to this, let's say connected to this, there is also the use of the color, right, like it's something that also somehow like detached from reality, almost the kind of the model as an, and it makes the model become almost like an object itself, right? Like, and I will stop here maybe with these three questions because there's a series of questions probably together. Yeah, I'll leave it to you.
Thanks, Francesca. I was also taking notes from your notes. It was a sort of notes of notes.
Yeah, I should, yeah.
No, it was thanks a lot. I always try a different question when we're asked about the model, a different way of answering the question about the technique. But I mean, in a very plain kind of and also very frank way, I can tell you that when we started, it was also maybe emerging as many things do out of a certain frustration with a way of working, because working with models is not just a way of presenting, it's also a way of working and being in the studio, of working with a team, of actually having the need and the possibility of working in space as you're doing things. I mean, it's super messy to start and it requires actually a lot of techniques, because indeed it is reduced then to one operation, perhaps of pouring, but the making of formworks requires any technique you can imagine, from metalworking to woodworking to carving or sculpting or anything, harvesting, finding the materials and so on. So it kind of brings a lot of things together. And that I think that the frustration was actually a bit from a way of working, but also perhaps from a bit of a kind of graphic overdose in the years in which maybe you and I were in university, which also in turn kind of emerged perhaps from some other kind of overdose or hangover. So the models began like that. And indeed, when we began a studio without built work of our own, but with a lot of ambitions, it was a way to have built work from the start. It was a way to have materials, things we could touch, things we could see, things that would have their own presence, things you could measure your body with immediately. So after that, we've been increasingly more confused about the scale of things, but that was certainly the beginning of it. And there's not a single project of these which has not changed in size, let's say, which has not been reduced or expanded due to budget or context. So that's a kind of a flickering that will always be there, and that we hope to play rather than be victim of, thanks to the model, or at least to this kind of thinking of these objects as models. Colors, I don't know, also this has been asked a few times and I still don't have a very good answer. What I thought now is actually that, I mean, first of all, if you work with materials, it's very strange. I don't think it's possible to work without colors to some extent, or it's really quite deliberate. I was looking at all of our, maybe we have a lot of pink elements. And part of that is also that iron oxide is the cheapest and most common pigment there is. So, and that is what gives us the color for most of the elements. In Turkey, one of the islands was actually known as the Iron Island. They used to harvest steel there. The shores were red. That's where the pigments were coming from. And every place has in one way or another a kind of a relation to it. And then indeed working with casting, actually, the tone of the colors that you achieve are often around the sort of pastel range. But I know it's not a completely convincing answer, but of course the opposite question, why don't you work with colors, would perhaps be even more apt in most cases. Yeah, I don't know, that's it, Farah. What do you think?
No, there is also something, then I leave to maybe question, please ask questions, of course, and there is the chat and the raise hands option. I was just thinking also that in the color, there is a degree of representation ability of the project, which is also another aspect that I'm very interested about, especially in relation to the work of the summer school that we will try to do with the students somehow. But it's this relationship between creating an object and archiving, let's say, representing that object and finding a narrative, right? Like, so of course, the color and the work that you do also with the photography that you said, like you work really almost like shoulder to shoulder, right? Like, and I think that there is something very interesting in the sort of entanglement between all these three aspects of the project of architecture intended as a process, right? And which is something that it can be really also mirrored in the way you explain the project, because the project never ends in the fact that you construct and you put them on sites. And the last project that you showed to us is exactly very emblematic on this, right? Because it is almost like a live performance. And this idea of like, of almost, is this idea of like, let the project live, right? And let the project be interpreted either through the eyes of the representation that the studio decides, but also through the eyes of the people and the animals that are gonna actually interact with the project itself. I think that there is this sort of stress and this emphasis on the architecture project as a process. Interesting, I think. Yeah. I don't know.
I think there's a question by Jean. Might be a follow-up, no?
I can't unmute. Okay. Yes, my question, thank you for that really exquisite presentation. I recently was participating in a conversation, and this quote by Heidegger was at the center of it, in which he says that stone has no world, animals are poor in world, and humans can world. And I was thinking that you do something very, very special, because and then further, Derrida takes that up in his work on bestiary and says that at the edges of the world, we encounter the animal, and that encounter produces a transformation of the figure. And I just think that this is something that you're performing and exploring in the most amazing way in your work, because you're worlding for plants and you're worlding for animals and you're worlding for stones. And at the same time, you're producing a site for an encounter at the edge of the human's world with the animal and allowing this transformation of figure. So I just wanted to make that comment that I think this is very remarkable that what you're doing.
John, thank you so much. Very beautiful words, and I'm not gonna add to it, but thank you.
I can't see no hands of I don't know if it's me, Bea or Sophia. I don't know if there are any other questions.
I would like to make like a very small and straightforward comment and hopefully like introduce like more questions from the students. Obviously, you were interested in this scale way before the pandemic, but I think there is something that elevated the care with which you deal with the small scale, the domestic scale, after having spent so much time within that domestic bubble. And I love this idea that there's this fusion of the kind of the parrot and yourself in becoming the users of these mystic amazing chairs. And I think it kind of rings so authentic, like so close to what we're trying to discuss this year at the summer school, this issue of care. And I think again, like you were already interested in that and you were already working in that scale. But I think post-pandemic, there is something even more important in the importance that you place, both in the fact that architecture is not anthropocentric, but also in the scale of your designs. And I wanted to kind of for you to share some thoughts in that transition, like from the pandemic to post-pandemic, and what you're kind of carrying with you forward.
No, thanks. I'll probably be rambling a bit because I don't have a kind of something ready for this, and we're still in it in a way. I can tell you that the biggest fear we had was that we were becoming very, perhaps even more kind of insular this year, that whether we wanted it or not, that we were living a little bit too much only with the company of our projects and our bird. And that was something we were a bit scared of. And I was happy to present these work today and present only those because this is kind of what we came out with in a way out of a year spent a bit like this. And also because I'm so relieved that I managed to travel to see these 3-4 projects in the last few months. I like that you bring up an idea of care. That was indeed also something that accompanied us also through conversations with Mariana Pestana for the past year, which was a lot about sort of thinking about empathy and care. And I think maybe one of the thoughts that we've been trying to work on, and that perhaps the isolation also gave us the space to kind of work on a bit, was in a way also to put an effort into really finding a way to love ourselves as humans as well, which is not as easy as it seems, right? But which I think is kind of the most fundamental project, to sort of try to work towards a definition of nature and of people and of relations, which allows to think without some kind of poisonous degree of self-loathing, let's say, of self-contempt, So to develop ideas of nature where of course, indeed, in a simple way, we are obviously part of, but in which we will never be the saviors nor the end of, in a way. So I think maybe the kind of constructive microcosm that we had during this year allowed to work this. We're working in a studio with birds in the Netherlands, which is essentially kind of a big garden where everything is cultivated. So it allowed for these kind of thoughts to kind of take a bit of root and therefore to give a bit of comfort, at least in what we had to say, not that it's the only story that is happening, but it's certainly one of the stories that are happening, let's say, in terms of kind of how we live and react to the environment. This is maybe bringing me a bit out, but and indeed, perhaps this kind of idea that there can be the coexistence of a sentimental, intimate scale at the scale of a territory, and that we can look at data and look at the single bird at the same time. That's something that I would really try to keep. Let's say that it's something I would really want to cultivate. And this, I think, again, comes a bit from kind of writing about conceptualizing the garden and kind of making a garden at the same time.
Great, thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, thank you. It was a great lecture. I just wanted to ask.
Hi, Dilara. Yes.
I just wanted to. I was really inspired by the way you talked about the cage. So not just as an enclosure, but I guess a potential for encounter and an interface. And it just made me think that the homes that we live in are also a bit like that. And I just wanted to ask if you've ever had the chance to work on that kind of urban typology in a similar way, or would you want to, or if you feel like these experiments you're doing right now work as this kind of independent island forms, or because I guess I can really see how they could become incorporated into existing typologies. So yeah, I just wanted to ask about that.
Thanks, Dilar. No, it's a really good question. And again, I'm afraid for all good questions, I don't really have a very good answer. Because these projects, I mean, projects for me are very interesting when they ask us as a studio, also professionally, to sort of deliver or work things at a certain scale, but where we find the space to at least act on a couple of scales above it and beneath it. And for instance, in the realm of housing, if I look at it at the Netherlands, I think we simply don't have the expertise right now to kind of master that discourse and have the virtuosism necessary to actually bring it to a step forward. We tried, and we also said, okay, this is not the time. The Netherlands and every country has a different economy and a different way of doing it. Already, I think that working on projects like this in Belgium would be a bit different than doing it in the Netherlands, for instance. So it's not like there's no interest. There is, I think, a need for a comfort and expertise, a kind of master of also of all the structures, not just of the regulatory, but also the financial ones and the technological ones and so on, which we really don't have in this moment. We are building projects. One of the projects I didn't show today is a floating museum we're building close to Amsterdam, which will open next year. And we've worked on some renovations, also things I didn't share today. You can maybe see some of these on the website, but yeah, I don't know. It was important now for us to have maybe, well, I'll frame it in another way. We're extremely lucky to have these kind of opportunities, which would allow for the conversation or the discussion we wanted to have with future clients and people to be distilled to such a degree, let's say. I'm not exactly sure where it will bring us, but so far we've rarely said no to a project. So if the opportunity came, and I hope that at this point it would be because someone wants a certain approach or a certain way of thinking about a theme, whether it's housing, then I imagine we would want to take it. We would want to take it as a project. Thank you.
Can I ask?
Sorry, I have the bell tower here. Jean, did you raise your hand?
Yes, I did. May I ask another question if there's no one else? Thank you. I just thought that something about working with enclosure, but in relation to caged, and
Yes,
the notion of caged, the notion of a caged animal. And I just thought there was, I hope you don't mind, but I think there's a sort of abolitionist aspect to your work in relation to carcerality, the sort of unworking of enclosures. And I just wondered whether you'd ever think of scaling up your models and your gardens to think abolition of a carceral institution, even at a phantasmatic level. I think you would bring something so brilliantly to the abolitionist project that tries to rethink the industrial carceral system. For instance, it's just a thought, and that links with your project of care.
Jean, thanks again for another kind of beautiful, beautiful thought. In fact, usually when I present these, the initial beginning of the Birdcages, I always bring up Foucault's story of his suggestion that Jeremy Bentham designing the Panopticon had the menageries of Louis XIV in mind. I don't know if it's true or not, but indeed there are true images of a Panopticon and of the menageries in Versailles, which are kind of strikingly similar, and the functionals in a very similar way. Not just the analogy, but I think also the power of space is exactly there. And the conversation, the vocabulary we use with animals is indeed the one we use for people. In part, it's the same that we use for plants. Perhaps with the fact that animals can look back at us, it makes the whole thing a bit more intense. We've been thinking about this, but it's always been a matter of debates. And I can also maybe explain a bit why I'm still a bit confused about how far the analogy can stretch. If, let's say, I'm gonna try to keep it only on the way our thinking is going in regards actually to these kind of rather literal enclosures. And in that case, I think what it becomes interesting after a certain scale is how perhaps objects, cages, traps, fences, aviaries have agency at a certain scale, and it's really words that have power at another. And there I'm thinking about the words of native, feral, invasive, non-native, domestic. English is full of words. Italian just as like true. It's always very confusing. Domestic in English being actually literal genetic selection of animals, while an animal being tame is one whose behavior has simply been kind of acclimatized to people. So in that sense, I always found that the conversations that we've been having, even the most kind of intense conversations we've been having, for example, also in Buyukada, where we're working with a kind of environmental group who only wanted native plants on the barge, which for us made absolutely no sense as a sort of impossible definition. But that is a scale at which I think I'd be very willing and also kind of interested and in a way even comfortable at bringing in that. I don't know how this could translate for me in a position that would not be contextual, let's say. I don't know how this could, I wouldn't know how, or if I'd want to make the translation across scales out of context. Maybe also because I grew up in a farm, so I've seen for most of my life more of a kind of rather violent and explicit relation to other species, and not together with this kind of sentimental one. I find it possible to kind of work with projects in context. So for instance, arriving to Buyukada and knowing a bit about the place and speaking with multiple people to think that the distinction between the native and the native doesn't really make sense or is not helping anyone. I don't know if I would have the same position everywhere in the world as a kind of absolute position. And I know we haven't even got to the kind of part on incarceration, which we're thinking of, but I hope it's a kind of a small step in that direction. I simply don't really have I think I need really good thoughts to share. If not that it is in many Maybe the reason I'm a bit afraid of it is that it captures the sinister trait of a cage without the kind of the ambition for tenderness that somehow the cage still has, even if it's a so that's why I maybe find it a bit of a slightly scary, but at least in this phase, sort of path to look directly at. But thanks again. I think I'm taking notes when you ask questions.
Okay, I think I can't see any other questions. I'm not sure if I'm mistaken. Because if not, maybe we should, given the time and the generosity of time, like I think we should probably end on this note. Thank you very much, Giovanni, and Studio Ossidiana, for this beautiful first talk of the summer school. Yes, well, thank you very much, everyone who turned up.
Well, thank you, Francesca, and thank you, Juliana. It was really great, and I love starting the public program in this way. You were the first one to go. So I think it was an especially great way of getting that on the road. I would just invite more people to participate, like turn on the cameras eventually. I know it's the first day, we all feel a bit awkward, even though we're kind of used to, I guess, like to go with this Zoom interaction. I hope that we can kind of hold on to some of the thoughts and some of the images that we saw today and use them literally and metaphorically the next couple of weeks. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, Giuliani. Thank you, everyone.